The sun had already punished the earth for 3 hours by the time Elias Croft drove his buckboard down the old Yucca Trail, hauling a half-load of fence posts back from Caldera Creek. He was not a man who looked for trouble, and he was not a man who went looking for conversation either. 52 years of living had worn him down to something essential. Lean jaw, gray-streaked beard, one eye that still caught light and one that had gone milky at Chickamauga. He wore his old cavalry coat in all weather, not out of sentiment, but because the weight of it on his shoulders felt familiar, like a hand he trusted. He almost missed it entirely. The ditch alongside the trail was dry and chalky, filled with broken scrub and the bleached skulls of things that had wandered too far from water. But something at the bottom caught his good eye. Not movement exactly. More like the idea of movement. A twitching that shouldn't be there. Elias pulled the reins. The horse, a roan mare named Abel, stopped without complaint. He climbed down slowly, his left knee announcing itself the way it always did in the dry heat, and he walked to the edge of the ditch and looked in. It was a golden eagle, a big one, wingspread that would have matched his own arm span if both were stretched wide. It lay on its side in the dust, one wing folded against its body, the other extended at an angle that made Elias wince. The wing was wrong, bent at a place wings weren't meant to bend. The bird's head was upright though, and its eyes, deep amber and savage as anything Elias had ever looked into, fixed on him without blinking. He'd seen a lot of things in ditches. Men mostly. Sometimes boys who'd been made into men too fast, and then unmade just as quickly. He'd seen horses and mules, and the occasional sinner, who'd wandered too close to someone else's claim. But he'd never seen anything look at him from a ditch the way this eagle did. Not with fear, not with surrender, but with something close to fury at its own condition. Elias respected that. He pulled off his cavalry coat, climbed down into the ditch carefully. The eagle snapped its beak once, a crack like a pistol, and wrapped the bird in the coat before it could do much damage. It fought him. God, it fought him. Even broken and half dead, it raked his forearm with one talon and drew a clean red line from wrist to elbow. Elias held on. He'd been clawed by worse. He set the wrapped bundle in the back of the buckboard among the fence posts, climbed up, and turned Abel back toward his homestead. He didn't know then that the eagle would cost him nearly everything he had. The homestead at Dusk. Elias Croft's homestead sat at 3 miles east of Dustfall on 40 acres of hard, honest ground that he'd filed on 6 years prior, right after he'd ridden away from what remained of his regiment at Fort Bowie and decided he was done taking orders from any man alive. The land wasn't pretty. It wasn't rich. The creek that crossed the southeast corner ran thin in summer and aggressive in spring, and the soil was more rock than earth. But it was his, which made it the finest land in the Arizona territory as far as Elias was concerned. He kept a small barn, a cabin with a front porch that leaned slightly east, a garden that produced beans and misery in roughly equal measure, and a chicken coop that had been raided by a coyote so many times that Elias had named the coyote Gerald and accepted him as a kind of neighbor. He set the eagle up in the barn on a bed of clean straw, still wrapped in the coat. He had to fashion a splint for the wing from a slat of kindling and some leather cord, and the eagle made its opinion of this procedure abundantly clear. By the time Elias was finished, he had 4 new cuts on his hands and a long gash along his chin, and the eagle had exhausted itself into something like uncomfortable rest. Elias sat back on a bale and looked at the bird. "You and me both," he said. He'd been a cavalryman for 4 years. Before that, a farrier's apprentice in Ohio. After that, after the war, after Chickamauga, after the things that happened in the red mud outside Chattanooga that he did not discuss with anyone and never would. He drifted west the way damaged men often did, as though distance from the origin of a wound might eventually constitute a cure. It hadn't. But Arizona had given him something the war had taken. Quiet. Long, genuine, uninterrupted quiet. The kind where you could hear your own thoughts without flinching. He fed the eagle strips of dried venison soaked in water, working them between the bird's beak with a patience that surprised even himself. The eagle ate, eventually. Grudgingly, as if accepting charity from a man in a broken-down barn was the most humiliating thing that had ever happened to it. Elias understood that feeling too. "You'll fly again," he told the eagle as he blew out the lantern. Give it time. He did not yet know that he had less than a week before the whole town of Dustfall would learn about the bird, and considerably less patience than an eagle for what would follow. Word traveled fast in Dustfall. It always did. Towns that small ran on gossip the way locomotives ran on coal, loudly, reliably, and in only one direction. It was Amos Purdy, from the feed store, who'd seen Elias driving back along the Yucca Trail with something large and wrapped in his coat. Amos had told Mrs. Kettlehorn at the dry goods, who had told her husband, who had told 3 men at the Tallow Creek Saloon, one of whom was a rider employed by Silas Vane. Silas Vane owned most of what mattered in Dustfall. He owned the bank, the lumber operation north of town, and a cattle empire that stretched across 70,000 acres of territory land. Land he'd acquired through methods that ranged from sharp business to something considerably darker. Depending on who was talking and how much they'd had to drink. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy in church and dangerous everywhere else. He was also in the middle of trying to acquire Elias Croft's 40 acres. The land sat between 2 parcels Vane already controlled, and its deed, properly filed, entirely legitimate, was the only thing preventing him from running a cattle corridor that would triple his drive efficiency to the railhead at Tucson. He'd offered Elias fair money once. Then unfair pressure twice. Elias had responded to all 3 overtures with a silence, so absolute it bordered on violence. When Vane heard about the Eagle, something shifted in his expression that his rider would later describe. In the saloon, as a man finding a door he hadn't noticed before, Sheriff Dale Pruitt rode out to Elias's homestead on a Tuesday morning, all brass badge and borrowed authority, with 2 of his deputies hanging back 30 yards, like they'd been told to look imposing, but not to get too close. Pruitt was a soft-handed man in a hard-handed country, and he knew it, which made him more dangerous than a confident man might have been. Dangerous people, Elias had learned, came in 2 kinds. Those who knew what they were capable of, and those who were still figuring it out. Pruitt was the second kind. Elias, the sheriff called from outside the cabin, not bothering to dismount. Got word you pulled a bird out of the Yucca ditch. Government eagle, that be. Protected under territorial law, Section 14. Elias came out onto the leaning porch with a tin cup of coffee and said nothing. I'm going to need to take it into custody, Pruitt continued. For its own well-being, you understand. There are people equipped to care for such animals. Wings splinted, Elias said. Moving it would undo the work. Be that as it may, come back in 3 weeks. Elias sipped his coffee. Bird'll be well enough to travel, I'll hand it to you personally. Pruitt shifted in his saddle. The deputies exchanged a look. This was the kind of stillness that preceded either conversation or gunfire, and no one present was entirely sure which. That's not how this works, Elias. Seems to me, Elias said, in a voice worn flat as a river stone, that a man who drives 3 miles out of town to collect a recovering bird is a man who's been told to. So you go tell whoever told you that the bird's healing and I'm keeping it until it can fly. He looked at Pruitt directly, good eye steady, milky eye unsettling as always. Then we'll see what kind of law Section 14 really is. The silence stretched. Pruitt turned his horse and rode back toward town. The deputies followed. Not looking back, Elias finished his coffee. The next 3 days moved through Dustfall like weather, slow, heavy and charged with something that hadn't broken yet. Silas Vane called in his debts. Not money debts, those were easy. He called in the debts that men owed him for favors they'd accepted and half forgotten and now wished they'd never needed. He had a quiet word with Judge Orrery about the legitimacy of Elias's land filing. He had a quieter word with the man at the Territorial Land Office about processing delays. He let it be known, through the invisible channels that powerful men had always maintained, that standing with Elias Croft would be noticed, and that being noticed by Silas Vane in a negative light was a particular kind of misfortune. Most people listened. Most people always did. But Dustfall was not entirely made of convenient people. Margaret Holt, who taught at the schoolhouse and who had once, 6 years ago, watched Elias Croft personally rebuild the schoolhouse roof after a spring storm took it, began asking quiet questions. She asked them at the church social and the town meeting and in the careful, persistent way of someone who already suspected the answers and wanted confirmation. She was 34, practical, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that didn't waste words. She rode out to Elias's homestead on Thursday evening. He was on the porch. The Eagle, visible through the open barn door, had managed to stand for the first time that afternoon. Unsteady, humiliated, magnificent. People are talking, she said, dismounting and tying her horse to the post without being invited. She was that kind of person. People always are, Elias said. Vane wants your land. He's using the bird as a pretext to get the sheriff out here and establish a dispute. Once there's a legal dispute on record, he can tie up your deed in the territorial court for years. He's done it before. Elias looked at her for a moment. You rode 3 miles to tell me something I already knew? I rode 3 miles, she said. To tell you that you're not alone in knowing it. She sat down on the step below the porch without asking. There are others. Len Marsh. The Duval brothers. Old Father Cass from the church. They don't like what Vane's doing, they just need someone to not flinch first. Elias watched the eagle through the barn door. It stood in its straw, trembling slightly with the effort, but its head was up and its eyes were scanning the middle distance with something close to calculation. The bird's not a pretext, he said quietly, it's just a bird that needed help. Maggie Holt looked at the eagle for a long moment. I know, she said. That's what makes it mean something. He came without sound, the way old men sometimes did in the desert, as if the lands itself permitted their passage. Elias heard nothing until the creak of the barn door, and by then he was already out of bed with the rifle in his hand, moving across the dark cabin floor in bare feet, his body still remembering 20 years of being alive somewhere. It shouldn't be. He came out the back of the cabin and eased around the barn wall, and found an old Apache man standing inside with the eagle. He was perhaps 70, perhaps 90, it was genuinely impossible to tell. His face was a document of desert time, lined and leathered and still. He wore a blanket over his shoulders despite the warmth, and he stood at a respectful distance from the eagle, not reaching for it, simply watching it. The eagle watched him back. Neither of them seemed troubled by the other's presence. Elias lowered the rifle to half ready and stepped inside. You want to tell me who you are? He said, quietly enough not to startle the bird. Nako, the old man said. He didn't look at Elias immediately, his eyes stayed on the eagle. My people called this one Biudasidilid. He paused. The one who carries light, your bird? No man's bird. Nako finally turned his eyes to Elias, and they were the darkest eyes Elias had seen, not hostile, but deep in a way that made you feel you were being measured against something large. But a sign. 3 times in my life I have seen one come down. 3 times something changed after. Elias said nothing. He had learned to sit with silence. The first time, Nako said, there was war coming. The second time, the water returned to the dry river. He glanced back at the eagle. The third time is now. What's coming now? The old man was quiet for a long moment. A choosing, for the people of your town. He looked at Elias steadily. The bird came down in the place where it did for a reason. You found it for a reason. What a man does with such things, that is also a reason. Elias leaned the rifle against the barn wall and crouched down near the eagle, which regarded him with its permanent amber fury. It'll fly again, Elias said. Another week, maybe less. Nako nodded slowly. I will tell you something, soldier. He used the word without contempt, simply as a fact, the way a man might say carpenter or rancher. The man who wants this land, he is afraid of what you have. Not the bird, not the 40 acres. What you have that he does not. He touched his chest once briefly. He has never gone to a ditch to help something that could not help him back. Then Nako left the way he had come. Quietly, thoroughly, as though the desert absorbed him. Elias sat alone in the barn with the eagle until the sky began to gray in the east. He thought about what a man was made of, when everything else was stripped away. Silas Vane came himself the next morning. This was unusual. Vane was a man who sent messages through intermediaries the way generals sent orders through aides. It preserved the distance necessary for deniability and protected the clean hem of his reputation. But something had shifted in the arithmetic of the situation, and he came himself, in his black-wheeled buggy with the silver fittings, wearing his church clothes on a Friday. He didn't bring the sheriff. He brought 2 men who stood wide and quiet behind the buggy and whose jackets bulged in the wrong places. Mr. Croft, Vane said. He stopped at the edge of the property line, a precise man, always within the forms of things. He had papers in his hand. I won't waste your time with pleasantry. I'm prepared to offer you $1,400 for this property. Cash, today. Elias stood on the porch. $1,400 was fair money. It was more than fair money, and Vane knew he knew it. No, Elias said. Mr. Croft, I know what you're doing with this land, and I know why you sent the sheriff out here over a hurt bird. Elias's voice was level, the way a rifle barrel was level before it was useful. You don't want the land, you want the corridor. And you're willing to spend whatever it costs and break whatever rules you need to break to get it. He stepped off the porch onto the dirt. But I've watched powerful men break rules before. I've watched them burn whole counties and convince themselves it was strategy. So you take your $1,400 and your legal papers and your two quiet gentlemen there, and you go back to town, and you think about what kind of man you want to be in the years you've got left. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Vane's jaw tightened. You have until Sunday morning, he said, very quietly. After that, I've instructed my attorney to file a dispute on the deed. You'll be in litigation for 3 years minimum. Everything you have will go to legal costs. He held Elias's gaze. I take no pleasure in this. Yes you do, Elias said. Vane's expression flickered. Just once, just briefly, with something that might have been shame. Then he got back in the buggy, the two quiet men followed. Elias watched them go. In the barn behind him, he heard the eagle beat its wings once. One strong, testing beat, like a fist striking a table. He turned and walked to the barn door. The eagle stood in the straw, both wings extended now, the splinted one trembling but straight. It held the position for 3 seconds, then folded them back. Its amber eyes found Elias across the distance of the barn. Almost, Elias told it. Sunday arrived in Dustfall with a sky, the color of old copper, which the old teamers said meant a dry storm coming, and the young ones ignored because they hadn't yet learned to read the sky like a letter. Elias was up before dawn. He'd slept poorly, not from fear, exactly, but from the particular alertness of a man who'd spent too many nights in enemy territory to fully trust a quiet one. He made coffee, fed the eagle, sat on the porch and watched the road. They came at first light. Not the sheriff, not Vane's men. People, Len Marsh first, driving a farm wagon with his wife and 2 sons sitting in the bed. Then the Duval brothers on horseback, their hat brims low against the morning glare. Then Father Cass in his old black coat on a mule that seemed personally aggrieved by the early hour. Then Margaret Holt, Maggie, riding straight-backed on her grey mare, and behind her a group of women from the church social and 3 men from the saloon who'd had the decency to look sober. They came and came. Elias stopped counting at 40 and continued watching. They stopped at his property line, the same line Vane had stopped at, and Len Marsh, who was a big man with a red beard and a voice like a barn door, called out, Elias. We heard what Vane said, we heard what he's planning. He paused. We came to say we won't stand for it. Elias stood up from the porch steps. The crowd waited. He could see in their faces the mixture of things crowds always carried. Conviction and uncertainty, righteous anger and the private terror of consequences. These were not soldiers. They were a school teacher and a blacksmith and a preacher, on a cantankerous mule. They had families and debts and the ordinary fragile life of ordinary fragile people. And they had come anyway. Maggie rode up to the property line and looked at him. Tell us what you need, she said simply. Elias took a long breath of copper sky air. He wasn't a man who asked for things. He wasn't a man who leaned on others or trusted crowds or believed that justice arrived on its own schedule out here in the territory. He'd seen too much of what men did to each other when no one was watching. But he was also, still, underneath the scar tissue and the silence, a man who had ridden into a ditch for something broken and held on while it tried to hurt him. Come in, he said. Coffee's on. They were all there. 47 people on and around Elias's porch and yard. When the sheriff's buggy appeared on the road, and behind it, Vane's black carriage, the crowd saw them. Nobody moved. Pruitt pulled up and took in the situation with the expression of a man who'd been sent to empty a pond with a tin cup. He looked at Vane. Vane looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at both of them. Father Cass stepped forward with a piece of paper he'd drafted at Maggie Holt's kitchen table the night before. It was a community letter. Signed by every person present, and by 12 more who couldn't make the ride. Stating in plain English that they had individually witnessed Silas Vane's pattern of deed manipulation across 3 separate properties in the past 5 years, and that they intended to present this accounting to the territorial governor's office in Prescott, in person, the following Wednesday. The paper also noted that a correspondent from the Arizona Weekly Citizen in Tucson had been contacted, and found the matter of considerable interest. Vane read the letter from his carriage, his silver-haired composure doing the best it could against a situation that had stopped being manageable. In the barn, the eagle had grown still. Elias had been watching it all morning with the particular attention of a man who knew when something was about to change. He excused himself from the crowd and walked to the barn. And opened both doors wide, the morning light cutting a long bright rectangle through the middle of the dark interior. The eagle looked at him. Elias crouched down and removed the splint slowly, hands careful and steady. The wing unfurled. Cautious at first, then with gathering confidence. And the eagle spread both wings full. In the open-doored barn with the copper sky behind it, the bird was enormous. Elemental. Something that did not belong to any ditch or barn or legal dispute or chapter of human pettiness. "Go on," Elias said. The eagle launched. It came out of the barn like a statement, great wings driving the morning air downward, and it crossed the yard at low altitude. Low enough that the crowd gasped and stepped back, some covering their heads, and then it banked and climbed, spiraling upward in tightening circles, until it was a silhouette against the copper sky, and then only a shape, and then nothing that eyes could find. The crowd stood with their faces tilted up, even Pruitt was looking up, even Vane. In the silence that followed, Elias came and stood beside Maggie Holt and they both watched the empty sky for a while. "He backed down," she said quietly. "I can see it in his face, for now," Elias said. "For now is something it is." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm obliged. To all of you." Maggie looked at him sideways. "You held a wounded thing and took the cuts and didn't let go," she said. "People saw that. Not just the bird, the whole of it." She paused. "That's not nothing, Elias." He looked at the sky where the eagle had been. It was a week since he'd climbed into that ditch. A week since the Talon had opened his forearm, and the bird had looked at him with fury and exhaustion in equal measure. A week since he'd made a choice that had, apparently, made several other choices necessary for everyone around him. Vane's carriage turned around slowly on the road and headed back toward Dustfall. Pruitt followed, not looking back. The crowd began to loosen and breathe and become ordinary people again, farmers and teachers, and a preacher, on an annoyed mule. Old Nako was not there. Elias had not expected him to be, but he thought of what the old man had said, standing in the dark of the barn with the eagle between them, a choosing. For the people of your town, he'd thought, then, that the choosing was about the land. About Vane and the deed and the territorial courts. Now he understood it was simpler than that. It was about what kind of people they were. Len Marsh appeared at his elbow, red beard and all, holding 2 tin cups. He handed one to Elias. "Good morning for it," Marsh said, squinting up at the empty sky. Elias accepted the cup. "Yes," he said, "it is." The deed dispute was formally withdrawn 6 weeks later. Silas Vane sold his interests in the Dustfall Bank the following spring and relocated to Tucson, where, by most accounts, he was someone else's problem. Margaret Holt continued teaching at the schoolhouse for another 22 years. Elias Croft kept his 40 acres until he died in 1901, and was buried on the southeast corner near the thin, aggressive creek. 3 people at the funeral claimed an eagle circled the property during the service. Gerald the coyote was not in attendance. But his tracks were found near the grave the following morning.